The early 2000s were an insane time to be a Metroid fan. In 2024, a time when Metroid games are a rare commodity, it's easy to forget just how much Metroid content Nintendo cranked out in the early 2000s. Ever since the release of Metroid Prime Remastered, I've been revisiting every entry in the Metroid franchise, and it genuinely surprised me how much Metroid content there actually was to go back to from that decade, especially if you compare it to the years before and after. The Switch has been surprisingly kind to Metroid with the release of Dread, Prime Remastered, hopefully Prime 4, and several classics through Switch Online. However, it's still nothing compared to the volume of Metroid games, the marketing materials, and other content we received in the early 2000s. Please hit subscribe to support the channel, and let's dive in to explore what was going on during this decade of Metroid. The Metroid franchise received a staggering number of releases during the 2000s. Starting in 2002, we had the simultaneous releases of Metroid Fusion and Metroid Prime, two of the best entries in the entire franchise. In 2024, the idea of getting two full-size brand new Metroid games on the same day sounds absurd, but that's exactly what happened 20 years ago. Metroid Prime made the incredible and immersive jump to full 3D, while Fusion provided a mainline sequel in the 2D Metroid timeline. Both games were important entries in the series, and they even supported interactivity between one another using the GBA link cable to unlock the Fusion suit in Metroid Prime. Incredibly, a short 2 years later, Nintendo released an even greater number of Metroid games in 2004. Metroid Zero Mission offered a full remake of the original Metroid from the ground up and delivered the same level of quality we saw with Metroid Fusion. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes somehow delivered an even bigger and deeper sequel to the original Metroid Prime just 2 short years later, an unbelievable turnaround for a sequel by today's standards, even if its light and dark world mechanics prove divisive to this day. 2004 also saw the release of the original Metroid for the NES as a Game Boy Classic, though infamously with an outrageous price point and basically no quality of life improvements. Nintendo also released a small Metroid demo game called Metroid Prime First Hunt as a pack-in for the launch of the Nintendo DS. Beyond 2004, the Metroid machine kept firing on all cylinders, and in 2005 we received Metroid Prime Pinball for the Nintendo DS, a sort of niche obscurity that recreated elements of the original Metroid Prime as a pinball game. The fact that this game exists at all is just evidence of the degree to which Nintendo was invested in the franchise during this time. The game was generally well received by critics, but ended up a bit of a novelty with limited content and even more limited sales numbers that didn't quite deliver the Metroid experience DS owners were looking for. However, the resulting wait was short, as Pinball was quickly followed up by Metroid Prime Hunters, the full version of the original demo pack-in. This game was notable for its focus on multiplayer and other bounty hunters besides Samus, though it also had a limited campaign mode for single player. Metroid Prime 3 finally landed in 2007 with unique motion controls on the Nintendo Wii. This entry provided a suitable ending to the Metroid Prime trilogy and a showcase for what the new system was capable of. Many players enjoyed these new motion controls, leading Nintendo to re-release all 3 Prime games as a unified trilogy on the Wii in 2009. This trilogy has become something of a collector's edition and really packaged everything together nicely with a unified control scheme and widescreen support, all on one disc. Finally, in 2010, we received the highly divisive Metroid Other M, which was not all that well received by fans, but still represents a whole separate initiative from Nintendo for another 3D Metroid. Like Pinball, the fact that this game even exists and was delivered as a separate vision from the Prime trilogy during this time period shows how much Nintendo was invested here. Interestingly, this is where the Metroid franchise went dark for a while and never really regained the same momentum since. It's also worth noting that Metroid was also just a bigger part of Nintendo's overall marketing and content strategy in the early 2000s than it is today. Metroid content during this time went well beyond just full game releases. For example, there was an exclusive Metroid Prime GameCube bundle released to try and drive sales of the system. Metroid Prime 1 and 2 both received amazing live-action commercials. Metroid Prime 1 was also released as a dual pack with the Wind Waker. Metroid content was heavily featured in both Smash Bros. Melee and Brawl. And again, Metroid was even part of the launch strategy of the Nintendo DS, as well as a major focal point at multiple E3 conferences. This flood of Metroid content in the early 2000s is especially interesting when compared to other decades. This franchise has been around since 1986, but no other time period even came close to this deluge of content. The 1980s saw only one Metroid game released, the original in 1986, and the 1990s only had two, with Metroid 2 in 1991 for Game Boy and Super Metroid in 1994. The franchise went radio silent for 8 years after that release, the longest in its history. Now, the story after Other M's release in 2010 is a darker tale. From 2010 through 2020, only 2 other Metroid games were released. The poorly received Federation Force focused almost entirely on multiplayer and not at all on Samus or classic Metroid gameplay. Samus Returns arrived a year later with a safe but quality remake of the original Metroid 2 that didn't exactly set the franchise on fire during this lull. 2010 through 2020 understandably felt like a lost decade in many ways for Metroid fans, and some even worried Nintendo was abandoning the franchise. It's interesting to analyze why Metroid releases sort of dropped off a cliff after 2010, or more specifically, why 2010 to 2020 was such a dark time for Metroid. Yes, Other M was bad in a lot of ways, although I personally think it's more fun than a lot of people give it credit for. But every great franchise can survive an occasional lackluster release, and with the way Nintendo had been cranking out Metroid games until then, it could have just been a blip on the radar if they had kept making more. But we have to remember this was the age of the Wii U, and that was probably a major contributor to the drop-off. Nintendo was really struggling during that console lifecycle and may not have wanted to put time and energy into the Metroid franchise, which has always had modest sales and attachment rates, even on the more wildly popular Nintendo consoles. That meant the semi-successful 3DS had to carry the torch for Metroid, but Federation Force was a dismal follow-up 6 years after the poorly received Other M. Samus Returns on 3DS was fine, but a remake of a Game Boy game from 25 years earlier wasn't exactly the recipe to reinvigorate the franchise. That game also awkwardly released after the wildly popular Switch was already out, almost certainly cannibalizing its sales and popularity. It's also possible that Nintendo simply ran out of creative juice for a while on the franchise, since Retro Studios kept the heart of the franchise beating for so long at that point and was no longer working on the series. The franchise was probably overdue for a creative break after such a relentless release schedule. All of these factors contributed to what now feels like a lost decade for Metroid, when some fans were left wondering if the franchise was slowly dying. Those fears were all put to rest, though, with the release of the long-rumored Metroid Dread in 2021. Dread delivered a much-needed shot in the arm for the franchise, arriving with plenty of modern energy while still capturing those 2D retro roots. This new decade is looking much better for Metroid, considering we already have Dread, Prime Remastered, and supposedly Prime 4, and maybe even other ports or remasters of the remaining 2 Prime games. There are also rumors that Mercury Steam is working on some sort of follow-up to Dread, even if it doesn't continue the same storyline, but I'll wait to see it to believe that. However, even if the Metroid franchise is experiencing some new life, it's still crazy to think that from 2002 to 2010, there were more brand new Metroid games released than in the rest of the franchise's nearly 40-year history combined. Personally, I think that in a perfect world, if Metroid Prime 4 delivers, and we get another follow-up from Mercury Steam, as well as a couple of those remasters, the 2020s could come close to recapturing that insane decade of Metroid, but for the most part, I believe that period in history will never truly be matched. Do you remember what it was like to be a Metroid fan during that time frame? Do you think we actually received too much Metroid content at the time, resulting in that lost decade? Do you think this current decade can potentially rival that historical high point, at least in quality, if not quantity? Leave a comment so we can discuss, and please hit the subscribe and like buttons to support the channel.